we have here on this channel, in which we read some spooky stories, some scary stories. So if you're new here, I'll link down below my scary story playlist, and if you've been here for this, then welcome back. Happy spooky season. I have five different stories for you tonight. Really excited to get into them. But before we do, one last thing is just in general a notice that some of these stories deal with heavy subject matter. They may allude to dangers and threats, real or imagined. Some may allude to general hardship, things like that. So, if you are not in the mood for that, that is perfectly okay. And in that case, I would suggest that you click off. You can watch any other video of mine or any other video by one of the many talented ASMR creators out there. And now, without further ado, let's get started. These are all true stories. The first one is called The Knocking. Oh, also I wanted to mention, I kind of loosely ranked them from what I thought was the least scary to the most scary. So, would love to know if you agree, and I guess that's good information if you want to dip out at any point because you've already reached your threshold, or if you want to amp up the scariness, then you can click to further in the video. Just click ahead. Okay, the first story is called The Knocking. When I was 12, every night for close to 2 months, someone would knock on my bedroom window. It was usually after 11 p.m. and before 2 a.m., and at the beginning would wake me from a dead sleep. A few times I even heard the knocking in my dreams and then woke up and the knocking was still happening. I lived in a ranch in a newish neighborhood, so there weren't any mature trees whose branches could be hitting the house, and I was certain of the distinct sound of knuckles on glass. I had a small nightlight, but no nightstand lamp, so I would have had to get out of bed and go to the other side of the room to flip the switch to turn on the lights. I had many blinds that covered the windows, but the thought of being illuminated with someone outside terrified me, especially because my bedroom window faced the backyard, which faced a giant cornfield. Everything outside at night was pitch black unless the moon was close to full. After a week or so of the knocking, I asked my younger sister if she was doing it. She was 7 at the time, and me even asking about it scared her, so she tattled on me to my parents. They confronted me, saying I was telling stories, and I swore up and down that I wasn't. The knocking kept happening for weeks and weeks, and my behavior changed because I was always scared and never sleeping. A teacher pulled me aside to inquire about my dazed state and the fact that I was not paying attention in class, and I told her about the window knocking. She took me to the principal's office, and he called my mom, and they had a meeting behind closed doors that my mom would not tell me about. My mom slept on the trundle bed that night in my room to see if I was telling the truth. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. to the knocking on my window and reached down to wake up my mom, and she wasn't there. I was terrified, stiff, and laid there until the knocking stopped, maybe 30 seconds, then slid to the floor got angry and said something like, "Fine, then tomorrow you and me and my shotgun will wait outside." The next night, I'd hoped he'd forgotten about that promise, but nope. We bundled up in all black, me and Camo, him, and wedged ourselves between the back deck and the house, with a clear view of both the cornfield and my bedroom window. A partial moon was up in clear skies, so you could make out the outline of the landscape in the house. I stargazed for a bit, but fell asleep pretty quickly, and my dad woke me up around 4 a.m. to take me back inside, saying all he saw were some deer in the cornfield, and maybe I'd been hearing bucks fighting. Then he went to bed. Not more than 5 minutes later, I heard a loud bang, bang, bang that hit so hard it rattled the blinds on the window. I almost peed myself, I was so scared, and laid awake for the rest of the night with my heart pounding so hard I thought I was going to explode. The knocking never returned after that, and my parents maintain to this day that it was all in my head. The next story is called The Apartment. It's short but freaky, in my opinion. Long ago, before everyone had dating apps on their phones, us gay boys would sit at our desktop computers and try and meet guys for sex on sites like Manhunt and Dudes Nude. One late night, I'd come home from the bars, jumped online, and started chatting with an unfamiliar local guy whose profile looked promising. We unlocked pics for each other and mutually agreed to meet up. He was hosting, which means I would go to his place, and I lived around the corner, and he lived around the corner from me. He told me his buzzer was broken and that I should just knock and come in. So, I walked over to his place on Gold Street between Fulton and John. The apartment was strange for New York. The door sat on the sidewalk. There were no steps, no lobby, no vestibule. It was just a door to an apartment right there on the sidewalk. I knocked on the door, which must have been ajar because it opened from my knocking. All the lights were off, but I could see from the street lamp that the apartment was completely empty, with the exception of a broom and a plastic bag of trash. No furniture, no lighting, no nothing. There was an open door to a room that was pitch black, so I said, "Hello, you here?" in that direction. No response. "Hello," I asked again. "I'm here," I said, but still no response. I was freaked out. I felt like I was being watched from the shadows. I stood there silently, afraid to make a sudden move, and all of a sudden, I could hear another person breathing softly. I turned around and booked it out the door around the block. I was afraid to go back to my building because I felt like he might have been following me. By the time I got back to my place, I sat down to send him a "what the F" message, but his profile had been deleted along with our chat. Silent scream. That one wakes me out. I just can't with the soft breathing stuff and scary stories. I just can't. Okay, the next story is called The Debt. The Debt. D-E-B-T. The Debt. My freshman dorm was co-ed. Boys and girls divided into parallel halls on each floor, split by a bank of elevators in the middle. On my floor, the elevators were rumored to be haunted by a student who had struggled with depression and died in his room about 15 years earlier. The circumstances were unclear, but part of the story was that he left behind a letter about how girls wouldn't talk to him. I'd heard about it when I first moved in, then forgot all about it. Later that first semester, I was struggling a bit in an advanced economics class. I sat next to this very sweet, shy guy, we'll call him K, plans when the professor called on him. One day after class, Kay mentioned that he lived on my floor and had seen me around and would be happy to help me study. I agreed right away, and we planned to meet in the library. Kay was an excellent teacher. I explained things in a way that our professor never could, and it was like retaking the whole class in 2 hours. I was so grateful. I told him I owed him one. His shyness vanished out of nowhere, and he asked me out then and there. I didn't find Kay that physically attractive, but his smarts and sweetness intrigued me, so I said yes. We made plans to go out that Friday. While I was getting ready, Kay sent me a message asking me to meet him in his room. He said it was just off the elevators. When I walked in, he'd set up pizza and beers and a movie. The plan had been to go get Chinese food down the street, but I was flexible, so I settled onto his futon. His room was very bare bones, nothing on the walls, no color, and I started to feel really uncomfortable, almost like a vertigo sensation. The second bed was stripped bare, and Kay told me his roommate had moved out because the room creeped him out, so he'd been living alone since then. If you haven't guessed yet, this was apparently the same room where that freshman had died years before. Kay told me he'd done a bunch of research on that guy, and he had all these issues with women, a record of stalking and harassment, and some drug problems, but also he'd loved horror movies and had an old webpage somewhere listing his favorite ones. Kay told me that he'd been trying to watch all of them, and the plan was to watch another one tonight. By that point, I was overwhelmed with intense dread. I told him I didn't like horror movies. Couldn't we watch something else instead? Shh, he's listening, said Kay, motioning around himself. He turned the movie on and put his arm around my shoulders. Nope, I needed to get out of there. I told him I really couldn't stand scary movies, and maybe we could do this another time. As I was turning his door handle to leave, he said, "Okay, but remember, you owe me." That became a theme for weeks. I aced the exam, and when I messaged him to say thank you again for the studying help, he replied, "You owe me." He wrote, "You owe me," on my roommate's dry erase board when we left the door unlocked one day. The letter U, the letter O, me. He wrote it again on one of the fogged-up bathroom mirrors while I was in the shower. He had clearly learned a lot from the horror movies he was watching. I was super freaked out and went to my RAs, who told Kay to leave me alone and stay out of the women's bathroom. He did, but he also started leaving his dorm door open all the time, so if I ever used the elevators, he'd be there, staring at me. Then he was just gone one day. His room door was open and everything was cleared out. Even the beds and desks were gone. The doorknob was missing from the door, and despite my experience gone sour, I remember feeling sad about it because he was so smart and really should have been excelling in college. He had started out sweet and helpful, a good classmate, and someone I thought for a moment could be a friend. But as I got to know more guys from his side of the hallway, they started sharing how Kay had gone from really nice and a little withdrawn to dark and mean and obsessed with the ghost of the guy who had died in his room. He claimed that the guy was talking to him at night and that his former roommate had actually moved out because he didn't feel safe in there. Security recovered several knives and other weapons hidden under his bed. My RAs finally told me months later that the school made him leave after he was found in one of the girls' bathroom stalls with a knife in his pocket. Ooh, guess he needed a sacrifice, joked the male RA, which I did not find funny at all, especially because they told me I needed to call the police if I saw him on campus, and especially because they didn't let anyone else move into that room. Not that year, and not the years after. The room became a legend itself, and the door always stayed open. People would claim to see dark figures in it late at night, or hear noises coming from it. I never dared to look in it again, kept my back to it whenever I was by the elevators. Cut to years later, I'm in grad school and engaged to be married. A few months before my wedding, my fiance and I both get a friend request from a random guy that neither of us knew. No profile picture, but he had gone to our college. I did a search for the name, and it led me to articles about the death in our dorm from the 90s. Someone was using that kid's name. And yep, you guessed it, I got a message request later that night that said, "You owe me." It's creepy. Okay, the fourth story is called Camping. Summer 97. I was 9 and scared of my own shadow, so this experience only furthered my fear of the world. My mom and I drove up from Revere, Massachusetts to Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire to camp. My dad was going to drive up the next morning to meet us because he had work. So, everything was going normal at the campsite. We set up the tent, built the fire, all was well. It was still daylight when we noticed this lone, greasy-haired man in the campsite across from ours, who was continually running and leaping onto a wooden post, then attempting to balance himself on one foot. He kept doing this over and over and over. It was odd, but we just figured he was some lonely kook and had a good laugh at his expense. My mom thought maybe he was trying out for the circus. Cut to nighttime. Absolute darkness if it wasn't for the campfire. My mom and I were sitting and roasting s'mores over the flames when we heard footsteps approaching from the other campsite. Out of the pines, the lone man stumbled onto our site, and he was ghastly and ragged in the firelight. I could tell my mom was tense. She asked the stranger what he needed. "Hey," he mumbled, I need your help in my campsite." We waited, and he didn't go on. My mom asked what he needed help with. The man said, "Locked my keys in my van. I need you to come over and help me." He then looked at me and said, "Don't worry, kid, you can stay here with your fire." It gave me goosebumps. My mom said, "I don't know how I can help you with your keys." "You must have a spare hanger lying around somewhere," said the man. My mom told him she didn't. The man wouldn't let up, though. He said, "Yeah, you must have a hanger lying around here somewhere. Maybe you dropped one nearby on the ground by your tent." My mom adamantly told him she didn't have a hanger and quickly added, "My husband will be here soon. Maybe he can help you. He's a pretty strong guy." "Yeah, all right," he said, and then he started to trudge away into the dark. But he turned his head and said, "Well, if you do find a hanger, come help me. I'll be here." And then finally he left. My mom and I barely slept that night. I felt her moving at every sound outside the tent. Looking back, my poor mother must have stayed up through the long night, worrying a butcher knife or something was going to slash the tent wall. But morning eventually came, and when we stepped out of the tent, we immediately saw that the lone man and his camper van were gone. Later in the day, I heard my mom shout. I ran over to her and watched as she picked something up from the ground beside her tent. She held it between us, staring at it, not speaking. It was a metal hanger. No. No. Alright, the last story is called The Neighbors. cozy despite being open to public traffic. Two lots across the alley are undeveloped and overgrown with tropical vegetation and large oak trees, providing ambiance. Bordering them is a lot with a single-family home facing the next street over, and a larger wooden two-story subdivided house in the back, built right to the edge of the alley. The upstairs units had balconies, large landings at the top of outdoor stairways, and they looked like bungalows among the trees. We often hung out in the alley with a fire pit, grilling food, sipping drinks, listening to music on a Bluetooth speaker. Friends would stop by on occasion to join us for little hangouts. A woman lived alone in the bungalow unit that had a view of our fire spot. She seemed to be unwell and would frequently berate and throw bottles at people in the alley, but none of her ire was directed at us, until it was. She would sometimes startle us and our friends by chiming in on fireside chatting from her balcony, which required a bit of shouting on her part. One night, she dominated all conversation with a graphic retelling of the film Apocalypto. We tried our best to stay on her good side by humoring these interruptions. The back of our warehouse is a workshop with no AC. The space is a 10-foot metal garage that slides up, and iron gates outside of the garage. Since we often keep this open for ventilation, my BF equipped the iron gates with rows of thin bamboo fencing overlapping to provide privacy but still allow for airflow. One evening we were zoned out, binging a show in the workshop, and he paused for a bathroom break. As soon as he disappeared into the other room, I heard the woman ask from just outside our open garage, "What you watchin'?" followed by a few questions about the show. The sort you might ask someone you're watching something with. She waited until I was alone to make herself known. I freaked out and screamed, "Fuck." My BF rushed out and discovered the woman was crouched on all fours on the ground outside, peering through the smallest gaps in the bamboo, watching us watch TV. After this, we adjusted for security. We installed CCTV and ceased our alley fire pit hangs. We had become the main targets of her outbursts. I also got a dog who I love more than anything ever. This was not for security and was something I had been wanting for a while anyway, to have a dog. But since I now had a dog who needed walking, I would occasionally encounter her waiting for me on the stairs, and she would sneer and make crude remarks as I attempted to hurry past and avoid eye contact. She said things like, "Wow, you're so skinny, not much you could do to fight back." One day she inflected a wicked witch tone and proclaimed, "I'm going to kill you and your little dog too." Threatening my dog was too far. It took everything I had not to respond. I lived with near constant fear of what her next grand gesture of terror would be, so I reached out to a friend, a criminal defense attorney. He used his subscription databases to find her name in records. It was not comforting information. She was known to possess a firearm and was fired from several jobs. She had been a security guard for erratic behavior. My friend warned me to be very careful, and I worried he was holding back what he uncovered to spare my mental state. I googled her and found her blog displaying amateurish paintings of semi-abstracted horrors. The paintings depicted the loss of a child, seemingly a toddler. I felt some empathy for her. When she occupied the balcony, she sat on one of those cheap white plastic lawn chairs, but always directly across from another exactly like it, except child-sized. I had assumed she used it as a footrest, but now, to me, it signified something tragic. Loud and violent episodes resulting in police visits were near daily events. The landlord moved to evict her. Her final departure was dramatic, and we watched on our CCTV while quietly listening, scared that she might damage our property or take whatever swipe she could days after, we often saw her car driving slowly through the alley, cursing the property as she passed, and throwing detritus out the window at her former home. I felt better when her appearances diminished, but just for a bit. Then a new tenant appeared, a single man. He didn't seem unhinged or troubled like his predecessor, but maybe a little off. On a morning walk, the man was there at the bottom of the stairs, as if waiting to greet me and my dog. I tried not to let history color what was probably neighborly kindness, but it did raise my hackles. He seemed to greet me before he could have known that I was there. There was some discussion between my BF and I as to whether his tenancy was legal. He always left the window on the balcony open, including during tropical storms and one hurricane. No one had seen him move in, and no one saw him move out. We didn't see him use the door or the lights. He didn't appear to own or use any form of transportation. When he would speak to me, it was unintelligible. I could make out maybe one or two words per interaction, and relied on a general contextual sense to provide my brief, nervous replies. He never spoke to my BF. He began to spend more time on the balcony. I told my BF I was feeling uneasy about the tenant, but there was nothing substantial to justify it. The encounters where he would shock me on dog walks were increasing. I couldn't figure out how he would always know when we would be coming. Was he spending the whole day at the base of the stairs, or was he just really eager to talk and really lonely? One day when I was walking, I realized a lot of the overgrown lot next to the bungalow had been gradually cleared, and that several parts of my walk were visible from where the man lived. There was no one on the balcony then, and when I passed the stairs in the alley, there was no one there. But the next day, taking the same route, I had the sense that I was being watched, so I looked up at the unit, and my stomach dropped to the core of the earth. In the window, I saw fingers parting the blinds. I stole glances at each of the unit's windows that were visible from my route, trying my hardest to be discreet by keeping my head down and glancing up with my eyes. And at every window, I saw the same thing, crinkled blinds with fingers holding them apart. He was moving around the perimeter of his unit to watch me from different vantages on my walk. Of course, when I rounded the part of the alley that met his stairway, he was there at the bottom with a greeting. I told my BF. He thought I was over-anxious, but said he'd check it out. I described the route to him, and he took my dog on a walk that day. He came back and confirmed that the blinds were warped in every spot that you could see from the route. After that, he firmly requested that I only walk my dog when he could come along, or to take a route that avoided the sight line of the building entirely. Before a lot of our questions could be answered, a big shakeup occurred. The landlord was not able to rent the front house for long, and the back units were nothing but trouble, so they evicted everyone and tore down both houses on the property. I watched the day it was demolished, gladly sucking down any asbestos, lead, and mold particles to see this monument of so much personal anxiety crumble. The contractors got a kick out of how I was watching their work and put on a show for me, which was fun. The blinds were so heavily crinkled that they never went back to form and remained creepily bent as they crashed into the earth. This property pushed me over the edge of belief in the supernatural, although most of these occurrences were clearly mental health related. And this is why, once the man started to use his balcony more frequently, he brought out a chair, one of those collapsible camping chairs, and a second chair, the same style but sized for a child. They were always arranged facing each other in the way the women's chairs were once situated. In the years we had to interact with this building and its tenants, we never saw a child there. Now, it is just an empty, overgrown lot like the two that sit next to it. There are some interesting pieces of salvage that I would scavenge from literally any other location, but I won't touch them there because of where they come from. On 2 occasions while walking my dog, I saw totally mundane things on the lot that was encircled with coconuts and